You see Blake Lively as Lily Bloom for the first time, your reaction is?
I will never picture anyone else. Like,
right.
She is absolutely perfect for the role. When he told me that she was thinking about taking it, I refused to get excited. I was like, oh, what if it doesn't happen? Because I was so excited that was a possibility. Yeah. Man, she knocked it out of the park. Yeah. And their chemistry together is insane.
Hey besties, welcome back to my channel. So, Judge Liman has just released a scathing ruling against Blake Lively, and honestly, if this is any sign of what's ahead with the upcoming motions or possible judgments, her entire lawsuit could be in serious danger of being completely tossed out. The big headline? The judge officially dismissed Jed Wallace from the case entirely. That's right. No more amendments, no second chances, nothing. The court basically said that New York has zero jurisdiction over Jed Wallace. None. Nada. Zilch. This decision dropped earlier today, and Judge Liman made it very clear. As far as the Southern District of New York is concerned, the case is dismissed with prejudice. That means it's done. She can't bring it back in this court. However, he did note that if Blake wants to refile in another jurisdiction that actually has authority over Wallace, she technically can. But here's the tricky part. Her current lawsuit is built heavily around all these different jurisdictional theories that try to connect Wallace to New York. So, if she decides to refile, she'll basically need to rebuild the entire case from the ground up. Now, one of the really interesting things in this order is how the judge addressed a few points related to Blake's FEA claims, the ones tied to workplace harassment and retaliation. And what he essentially said was this: Blake's FEA claims don't hold up against Jed Wallace because they're not true employment or workplace claims. They're actually defamation claims disguised as workplace discrimination. Let's break that down. According to the judge, Blake's lawsuit tries to establish personal jurisdiction over Wallace in 3 different ways. First, she argues conspiracy jurisdiction, saying that Wallace and others acted together in New York as part of a conspiracy and that their contacts with the state should count against him. Second, she claims that Wallace committed acts outside of New York that caused harm within the state, and that he should have reasonably expected those actions to have consequences there. And third, she again argues a conspiracy theory, that Wallace's co-conspirators did business in New York, so those actions should legally connect back to him. But here's the problem: the judge says Blake failed to prove any of these arguments. So bottom line, New York courts can't touch this. And the judge didn't stop there. He also poked serious holes in her retaliation narrative. What she's describing as workplace retaliation doesn't actually look like workplace discrimination at all, it looks like defamation. And that detail could ripple across the entire case, potentially affecting all her remaining FEA claims against other parties. Here's what the order specifically said. The Wallace defendants argue that Blake's 2 claims against them, false light invasion of privacy and aiding and abetting harassment and retaliation, both really fall under defamation. Therefore, they're exempt from New York's conspiracy jurisdiction laws. And the court agreed. The judge wrote that the heart of her claims is damage to reputation, not workplace harm. He said the claims sound in defamation, meaning they're fundamentally about reputational injury, and therefore jurisdiction can't be based on those theories under the law. That's a major blow. In simpler terms, the judge is saying that Blake's harassment and retaliation claims are actually about how her reputation was damaged, not about mistreatment at work. And that's a huge distinction, because reputational injury doesn't count as workplace harm, especially after an employment relationship has already ended. He even went on to note that her allegations consistently focus on how her public image and reputation were affected, not her work conditions. The complaint itself ties her supposed financial losses directly to reputational harm, not to any clear workplace damages. So, in the court's view, this entire case reads like a defamation lawsuit that's been repackaged as harassment and retaliation. And under New York law, you can't do that. You can't take what is essentially defamation and just label it as something else like invasion of privacy or workplace discrimination. The court sees through that, and that's exactly what happened here. Judge Liman essentially ruled that what Blake's calling harassment and retaliation is, in reality, defamation in disguise. Even her invasion of privacy claim, according to the court, is really another form of defamation at its core. The only injuries she clearly described in her complaint were reputational ones, which makes it hard to argue that she was actually the victim of workplace retaliation. And that's the kicker. Because once the working relationship is over, those kinds of claims don't qualify as employment-related injuries. The judge made it clear that all of Blake's arguments trying to separate her case from being labeled a defamation lawsuit just didn't convince him. He explained that Blake's position, claiming her false light allegation isn't a defamation claim because she didn't specifically base it on defamatory statements, doesn't hold water. In her view, since she didn't point to any direct defamatory remarks or challenge the truth of any particular statement, her claim shouldn't count as a reworded defamation suit. But the judge completely rejected that reasoning. He stated that a plaintiff can't sidestep defamation law by simply avoiding naming specific statements or by rephrasing the injury to sound like something else. What determines whether something sounds in defamation, he said, isn't how the plaintiff packages the claim. It's about the nature of the harm itself. So, even if someone doesn't call it defamation, if the alleged injury is about damage to reputation, then it's still defamation, regardless of how it's described or delivered. The court emphasized that what matters most is the actual harm being claimed, not the label the plaintiff gives it, not the format of the message, and not whether she's identified a single quote as defamatory. In other words, Blake can call it false light all she wants, but if her damages stem from her reputation being hurt, it's defamation. The judge even cited a past decision from the New York Court of Appeals that said the same thing. If the harm a plaintiff claims, like injury to their good name, is the same harm caused by defamation, then it's still considered defamation under the law. Now, when it came to her FVA claims, the judge had more to say, and it's fascinating. He acknowledged that most FVA retaliation cases usually have nothing to do with defamation. But in Blake's situation, he said, it's an exceptional case, one where every alleged act of retaliation revolves around attempts to destroy her reputation and credibility rather than any real workplace mistreatment. He highlighted that the only adverse employment action Blake's complaint specifically mentions is a supposed coordinated campaign to portray her in a negative light during the promotion and publicity of her film. So, according to him, Blake's FVA claims essentially rest on these same accusations that people tried to publicly smear her image, which the court already ruled are forms of defamation. In simple terms, the judge said, what Blake is describing as a smear campaign isn't a workplace issue. It's about reputational harm, not employment discrimination. She's arguing that this campaign hurt her business opportunities and damaged her image, but she isn't showing that it affected her job directly. This distinction could have huge consequences for Wayfarer, Justin Baldoni's company. When they file for summary judgment, they can now argue that since the court already found Blake's claims to sound like defamation, not workplace injury, her FVA arguments don't meet the legal standard. That could lead to the court dismissing those claims under the same reasoning. On page 21 of the order, the judge sums it up perfectly. He wrote that the fairest reading of Blake's allegations, and of the entire case in general, shows that all of her supposed injuries stem from harm to her reputation. Even the non-reputational harms she tries to describe ultimately trace back to reputational damage. For example, the judge pointed to Blake's claim that, because of the ongoing smear campaign and all the negative online sentiment, she felt she couldn't appear publicly or attend events. She said she had to cancel an important Target corporate event for her haircare line, as well as an invitation to host the 50th anniversary premiere of Saturday Night Live. She also claimed she skipped appearances for her other business ventures for those same reasons. Her lawsuit even specifically ties the sudden wave of negative press to declining sales for her haircare products, saying her brand got caught in the crosshairs of the retaliation campaign allegedly started by the defendants. But legally speaking, as the judge noted, financial losses or missed business opportunities that come from reputational harm are defamation injuries, not workplace ones. They don't qualify as employment retaliation under the law. And that's critical because this reasoning doesn't just apply to Jed Wallace. It could also affect all of the other defendants once the summary judgment motions begin. Wayfarer and Baldoni could point out that Blake's entire argument relies on claiming that damage to her reputation counts as a workplace injury, and the judge just ruled that it doesn't. Under employment law, for something to be considered an adverse workplace action, it has to reach a certain legal threshold. It must be comparable to tangible workplace consequences, like getting fired, demoted, disciplined, or otherwise facing measurable harm related to your employment. Reputational harm doesn't qualify. The judge noted that Blake's workplace claims, things like loss of professional standing, damage to her reputation, loss of future income, and harm to her career, simply don't count as employment actions. They're public relations consequences, not employer retaliation. That's why these allegations, he said, sound far more like defamation than discrimination. This logic could severely weaken all of Blake's FVA claims connected to the alleged smear campaign. And once those are gone, the only remaining FVA claims, specifically the sexual harassment allegations, could be thrown out too, because they're time-barred under federal law. According to legal standards, you must report a workplace harassment incident within 300 days of the last event. Blake herself claimed the last instance happened in May 2023, meaning that time window has already closed. So this ruling could end up being catastrophic for her entire case. It also seems that Judge Liman issued his order a week before the summary judgment deadline on purpose, likely so both sides could address this issue directly in their upcoming motions. That means Wayfarer, Baldoni, and others will probably use this fresh ruling as a key argument to have the rest of Blake's case dismissed at the summary judgment stage. Because summary judgment isn't about debating facts, it's about determining whether the case even meets the legal standards to move forward. And since the judge has already decided these FVA claims boil down to defamation, the defense can now argue that they should be eliminated under the law without further trial. They won't even need to get into complex jurisdictional issues. This one ruling might be enough to have it all thrown out. It's honestly a huge win for Wayfarer and everyone else named in the lawsuit. The judge even added that Blake's emotional distress claims are also directly tied to the same smear campaign, the negative publicity, and the online attacks that came with it. So once again, her emotional and business injuries circle right back to reputational damage, not employment discrimination. The judge pointed out that Blake's case looks almost identical to others, where courts decided that claims for intentional or negligent infliction of emotional distress were actually just defamation in disguise. In other words, every time Blake argues that she was put in a false light, shamed publicly, or had her reputation damaged, under New York law, that all falls under defamation, not an FVA violation, not retaliation, not discrimination, and definitely not a workplace-related issue. It's simply defamation. He also noted that even the harms Blake says came from the defendant's lawsuit against her, which she insists was retaliatory and baseless, still boil down to reputational harm. And that matters, because it means these aren't genuine workplace discrimination issues. This also suggests that the judge may not take her Rule 47.1 motion for attorney's fees seriously either, since that part of her claim is rooted in reputation-based injury, not actual employment discrimination. Another thing to remember is that the judge keeps relying on New York law, not California's, which is another problem for Blake. New York's laws about defamation and jurisdiction are notoriously strict, so this already puts her in a tough spot. Then, when it came to her aiding and abetting claims, the judge said her responses missed the point completely, just like her arguments about false light. Blake argued that the aiding and abetting wasn't just about people spreading negative stories about her online. She claimed it also included providing advice, counsel, and strategic input to the Wayfarer team, basically helping them plan and execute what she calls their retaliation campaign. She insisted that those kinds of activities don't even sound like defamation, but rather represent core aiding and abetting behavior, no matter how that alleged retaliation was carried out. That's her argument, but the judge didn't buy it. He responded that even if Wallace or anyone else did offer advice or guidance, the key question remains. Advice and guidance about what, exactly? And the only reasonable answer, according to both her complaint and her filings, is advice related to publicity, PR, and shaping public perception. That means, once again, it's about public image and reputation. The judge emphasized that Blake's entire response focuses on the actions themselves, like who said what, or who strategized with whom, instead of focusing on the nature of the injury she claims to have suffered. And that's where her case keeps falling apart. He reminded her that, unlike most torts, defamation isn't defined by how the harm happens, it's defined by what kind of harm it is. If the injury is to reputation, it's defamation, no matter what form it takes. In the end, The judge concluded that Blake completely failed to establish personal jurisdiction over Jed Wallace. And that conclusion is even more striking given how much discovery has already taken place in this case. He pointed out that unlike most dismissal motions, this one wasn't early in the process. There's already been extensive discovery. Blake has had time to dig into evidence about when the Wallace defendants supposedly joined the conspiracy and what they allegedly knew. But even with that discovery, the judge said the evidence simply wasn't convincing. She couldn't prove that hiring Wallace while they were in New York or certain film-related events in the state gave the court jurisdiction over him. She even tried to argue that just posting documents from the lawsuit online through a New York-based website was enough to establish jurisdiction, and the judge flat-out rejected that idea too. What stands out most here is how he's treating this case, not as a workplace or discrimination issue, but as a free speech matter. He's clearly looking at it through the lens of First Amendment protections and the legal limits of defamation law. He even made that clear on page 39 of the order, where he wrote, "Exercising personal jurisdiction over the Wallace defendants based on such a broad conception of agency and conspiracy would be inconsistent with free speech considerations and New York court's instruction to apply jurisdiction narrowly in defamation cases." Then he gave a detailed hypothetical example to explain why. He said, "Imagine a scenario where several people across the country organize online to draw attention to an important public issue, like exposing a defect in a popular consumer product. Let's say they're all spread out across different states, except for one person who happens to live in New York. Now, those people research, write, and post about the issue from their own states, and of course, those posts are visible online in New York. Under the law, the individual in New York could potentially be sued there for defamation or product disparagement. But the others, the ones who live in other states, are protected from being dragged into New York courts just because their content was seen there. However, if the court accepted Blake's expansive theory, those out-of-state individuals could be sued in New York anyway, as long as the plaintiff alleged that they were aware of the New York-based members' actions and shared the same goals. Even if they had no control or direct involvement, and even if their activities happened entirely outside New York. The judge said that applying her theory would create a dangerous loophole, one that could completely undermine the defamation protections built into New York law. It would basically open the floodgates for New York courts to go after anyone, anywhere, over online statements, and that's something he was absolutely unwilling to allow. So, because of that, he refused to apply her theory of jurisdiction to Wallace. He made it clear that doing so would have far-reaching consequences, not just for this case, but for free speech across the state. If he allowed it, it could mean that anyone in the U.S. who ever participated in a group discussion online could suddenly be sued in New York for defamation, even if they never set foot there or directed anything toward the state. That's why the judge held firm. All those connections Blake tried to draw, mentioning people like Jen Abel, Kate and Ka, Melissa Nathan, and even Wayfarer, didn't matter because Wallace himself wasn't directly tied to any of those New York-based events or individuals. In the end, the judge wrapped up by saying that, since the court decided to dismiss for lack of personal jurisdiction, it didn't even need to address Wallace's other arguments, like whether Blake failed to state a valid claim or whether the venue should be transferred elsewhere. That was it. Case closed, at least for Wallace. The judge officially ruled that the case is dismissed due to lack of personal jurisdiction, meaning Blake Lively filed it in the wrong court. The dismissal was made without prejudice, so technically she can refile the lawsuit, but only in a court that actually has jurisdiction. If Blake wants to pursue this case again, she can't do it in New York. After 2 separate attempts to prove that Jed Wallace had ties there, she still failed to convince the judge. He wasn't persuaded that other people's actions could legally be pinned on Jed. Honestly, this ruling reveals a lot about the judge's mindset. It shows that he doesn't seem to believe that negative publicity automatically counts as workplace retaliation or discrimination. And under New York law, any claim that centers around damage to reputation is treated as defamation, not harassment or retaliation. That legal distinction is what's working against her here, and it's a massive blow for Blake Lively. The judge even went so far as to address her claim that a frivolous lawsuit harmed her reputation, noting that even that sounds like defamation. But from his perspective, it doesn't seem like he believes the original lawsuit against her was frivolous at all. If anything, His tone suggests that her current lawsuit might be the one that's frivolous. Now, if she decides to refile this case somewhere else, say in another state, she's got a lot of work to do. She'll have to completely remove every mention of New York, and that's dozens of pages of her complaint gone. The new filing would have to focus only on Jed Wallace and nothing else, to avoid confusing the next court. If she does refile in Texas, she'll be dealing with a whole new set of rules. Texas law is stricter about what can be considered a valid claim. She'll need solid evidence proving that Jed Wallace actually did what she alleges, not just speculation or connections. And here's the kicker. If she files in Texas without real proof, she could face sanctions or even financial penalties. So if this same case had been filed there from the start, it probably would have been thrown out for lack of evidence or because it just doesn't hold up as anything more than reputational damage. That's the core problem for her. Everything in this lawsuit boils down to her reputation. She never had solid proof tying Wallace directly to any specific act. What she had was a theory, not a factual case. That theory rested on the assumption that he was behind her bad press, that he somehow orchestrated the negative coverage. But this ruling basically exposes that for what it is, a repackaged defamation case, not one about harassment or retaliation. At its heart, this whole lawsuit seems like an attempt to shift blame for the bad PR surrounding her. It doesn't appear to be about workplace misconduct at all, more about trying to fix her public image by pointing fingers elsewhere. So, to sum it up, this is a devastating loss for Blake Lively. It also explains why she's been filing so many sanctions motions lately. She's clearly trying to control the narrative, to push back against the negative headlines that are now hitting her one after another. But the reality is, this ruling leaves her incredibly vulnerable. Over the next few months, as the rest of her claims continue to fall apart, she'll likely face even more damaging press. And now that Jed Wallace has officially been removed as a defendant, her entire argument about a smear campaign loses its foundation. He was supposed to be the mastermind behind it all, but with him out of the picture, that story just doesn't hold up anymore. In short, things are looking really bad for her. This is a serious setback that changes the direction of her entire case. So what do you think, besties? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. Don't forget to give this video a thumbs up, hit subscribe if you haven't already, and tap the bell so you never miss an update. Thanks for watching. See you in the next one. Bye, besties.